Good morning, church.
Good
morning.
In 2015, Stephen Fry, you may know, you don't know, he's a comedian, TV show host, famous intellectual. He was in an interview and they asked him, I don't know the context of this question, but they asked him, what would you say to God if you made it to heaven? And being an atheist, you can imagine his answer was kind of full of a bit of angst and frustration. He said this: I'll say to God, bone cancer in children, what's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? You may remember that interview. There was a lot of coverage of it at the time. But we need to reckon with the fact that suffering and evil is one of the most common objections to faith in God and belief in God and religion generally out there at the moment. So we need to take it really seriously as Christians, and not just because it's a huge objection, but also because we see it around us all the time in daily life. And if it provokes that huge question, doesn't it? If God is real, why does he allow evil and suffering to happen? Stephen Fry's, for his position as an atheist, his position is logically consistent. It's something I probably might have said at some point in my life. And other people will have similar kinds of questions about this huge area. It always comes up whenever there's some kind of huge natural disaster. You may notice that the media will come and find a rabbi and an imam and an evangelical Christian or a vicar somewhere to talk to them about the problem of evil and suffering. It was a big thing during the pandemic. We cannot avoid this huge question that just looms large over all of life. We need to be prepared for it. We need to be able to have meaningful conversations that go beyond just the sound bites. We need to avoid neatly packaged answers to these questions. We need to avoid robotic theology. We need to be human with this huge topic. Suffering is a huge part of life. In fact, I would say it's inevitable. We will all encounter suffering of some kind, and it will cause us to reflect deeply about the big things of life. It may cause us to doubt God and his purposes. So we need to be really careful. We need to have a careful, robust theology before it arrives. And so today and next week, we're going to do what I might call a whistle-stop tour of the book of Job. I'm going to look at what it has to say about these things. And I know in my heart, standing before you now, I want to be really sensitive because I'm not a pastor, I'm not a counsellor. I've not really suffered in my life. But I want to be aware of the fact that you might be suffering today, or you might know someone, love someone deeply who is suffering. So this is a hugely emotional subject to be delving into right now. And I'd encourage you, don't just accept everything I say. Weigh it against what you see in the Bible. If I say something unbiblical, and you think it's not in there, then you're very welcome to question. Pull me aside, continue the conversation. But the book of Job, you may not have read it before. It's in the Old Testament. It's this obscure ancient text. Some people believe it may speak of a time even before Abraham, but it has these deeply profound messages in it. And in some ways, we don't know if Job was a real man or if it's meant to be fictional. But it's this hugely powerful text, which I believe gives us valuable insight to the issues around suffering and evil. So if you have your Bible with you, can you flip to the book of Job, or if you're on your phone, then it's probably quite a lot easier to locate it. But if you do have a physical Bible, it's just before the book of Psalms. somewhere in the middle. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read the first 2 chapters, and then we'll take it from there. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. So this man was the greatest of all the people in the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house, each one on his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless, upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil." And Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him, his house, all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were ploughing and the donkeys feeding beside them. The Sabeans fell upon them, took them, struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another. He said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another. He said, The Chaldeans formed 3 groups, and made a raid on the camels, and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another, and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness, and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. I alone escaped to tell you." Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one the foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. before God. He loves God.
Dropped out. Sorry.
Okay. Job loves God and he fears God in a good kind of, he doesn't cower from God, but he fears God in a good, healthy way. Offers sacrifices on behalf of his family. So he's going way above and beyond what normally people do. And he seems to be a happy and content man. Job is a blessed man. And then we're taken to this courtroom scene where God is seeking counsel, and among them is Satan, the devil. And they're discussing Job, and God is proud of Job, right? But Satan is not impressed. Satan accuses Job, as he does with all of God's people. He says, Job only loves you because you blessed him. So God permits Satan to mess with Job's life, but puts a very strict limit on what Job is allowed to do. And then we're taken to this harrowing scene where one by one, all of Job's servants come to report all this devastation that's happened to Job's livestock and then eventually to his children. But in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So Satan goes back to God and increases the stakes. Stretch out your hand and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to his face, to your face. So God does permit physical suffering to happen to Job, but only to spare his life. And so Job is struck with these painful sores, and he's this kind of really pitiful scene where he's just sitting in the ashes of his estate, scratching himself with broken pot. It's this miserable scene. Even when his friends come along, they don't even recognize him for how much his physical appearance has changed. And he's lost everything. And now he's enduring physical torture. But it gets yet more worse because Job's wife then abandons him, his closest and most meaningful relationship in his life, leaves his side, and emotionally and relationally, she ends up criticizing his devotion to God. So now he's totally alone in all this pain until his friends arrive, and they actually do bring a momentary bit of comfort. For 7 days, they sit with him in silence, showing solidarity. And sometimes we just need someone familiar, don't we? Just to sit with us. Sometimes we can make things worse with our words. And still, in all of this, Job did not sin. And then Job's friends do start speaking. We haven't read that yet, but from chapter 3 onwards, there's just this back and forth between Job and his friends. And this is really where it all goes wrong, because Job's friends repeat the same thing. They want Job to realize that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Job must have sinned. That's the only possible explanation. That's what the friends think. So Job should just confess and stop questioning God. Well, Job's friends are working with a huge assumption. Job gives up on his friends eventually and takes his complaint straight to God. Where are you, God? Are you not in control? What have I done to deserve this? I'm innocent. This is everything that Job says to God. Why do you deny me justice? Either you are not in control or you are an unjust God. So Job's friends are operating with this assumption, and now Job is revealed to be operating with this assumption. And the truth is, all of us wrestle with that same assumption, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. How many times have you secretly wondered if God is punishing you when something bad happens in your life? Or have you ever been tempted to feel that when something good happens in your life, it's because you've lived your life well, and that you deserve it? Perhaps you're tempted to believe that as long as you're a good person, God will keep you and your family safe, and you'll be spared from some of life's worst things. We see that kind of thinking in films and in TV, don't we? The main character becomes desperate and makes a bargain with God. Let me live and I'll turn my life around. Martin Luther, the great reformer, made that same assumption with God. Martin Luther was struck by lightning and was nearly at death and said, God, if you spare my life, I'll become a monk. That was the beginning of the Reformation. And even the disciples, they had this assumption. When they saw a blind man as they were walking with Jesus, they said to Jesus, why was this man born blind? Because of his sin or his parents' sin? Because it must be someone's sin, right? Jesus doesn't answer that question directly, really. He says neither. Because this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And then Jesus heals him there and then. But why do we get stuck in this way of thinking? Well, I put it to you that I think we're addicted to justice. And that's a good thing in some ways, so long as it's not the ultimate thing, right? We're addicted to justice because we're wired this way, because we're made in God's image. God is just, therefore we desire justice. Just think about it. Anytime someone accuses you, do you feel that your inner lawyer rising to the surface, jumping to your defense, producing counter accusations? We've all been there. Sometimes it's tempting to see the world as a set of scales that need to be balanced, or an elaborate point system. If I do X amount of good, I'll be blessed X amount, like some kind of Tesco club card point system. But God is not a vending machine. But the challenging thing with all this is it's sort of true, isn't it? I mean, I use this in my parenting all the time. When I get desperate with my children's behavior, I really want them to know that good behavior will be rewarded and bad behavior has consequences. Okay? So it is true to some extent. We know that that's true, a big true part of life, but it's not a full explanation of life and the universe because it's too simple. And the Bible says it's too simple. If you read through the whole book of Proverbs this afternoon, you may come away from that reading exercise thinking that those that pursue honor and righteousness will live long and healthy lives. And it's true, isn't it? Don't smoke, you'll live longer, right? But the next day, if you went ahead to another book from the wisdom literature and read the whole of Ecclesiastes in one day, you'd come to a completely different conclusion. You'd realize, well, it doesn't matter how you live. Bad stuff happens to everyone. Life is meaningless. And that's true as well. They're both true at the same time. And this is the wisdom of the Bible, that it provides us with lots of different perspectives. It's like when you listen to a song, you can listen to the bass line all the way through. You're still listening to the same song. You listen to it again, you can listen to the drum pattern. And you're still listening to the same song, you're just listening to a different part. I think what the Bible is saying is that we need to try and inhabit a theology and a philosophy of life that accepts lots of seemingly contradictory things to be true at the same time. We could go on a wide-ranging exploration of everything the Bible has to say about suffering, but I don't know if that will be helpful, and I don't think I could do it justice in the time we have. So what I'm going to do is focus on what the book of Job has to say about the question of suffering. What does Job uniquely say to us? Well, there are two main ideas that are going on here. It's not everything that you can get from the book of Job, but there are two things I want to draw attention to here. Is one, we have an adversary. You can't really read the book of Job and come away from not realizing this, that Satan is real, that evil is real. And there's a big part of why suffering exists. In the beginning, God created the world and it was good, but Satan was there right in the beginning, undermining God, causing us to doubt God's goodness, planting a desire in us to rule and reign. And we fell for it. And fundamental to being a child of God is choosing to let God determine what is right and wrong. But then the fall happens. Genesis 3, we are cast out of Eden. Our relationship with God is broken. We live with this shame and guilt. What's more, creation itself is broken. Sin enters the world and sin pollutes everything. It causes all kinds of sickness and suffering. And then Jesus offers us a way out. Jesus is the second Adam. Jesus comes and undoes all of the damage of the fall. He rescues us from the full effects of the fall. The world is still broken, we can experience a partial kind of freedom here and now. But Satan is still active. He's still out there accusing us. He's still using our suffering to cause us to question God. Satan hates the church. He wants us to lose confidence in our security and salvation. But this is the key. While Satan is still active, his power is limited. He can only ever do what God permits. And that is so important, because we need to be really careful not to give him more influence in our lives than the Bible does. Yes, he is powerful. Yes, he is real, but God has him a very short leash. You can find yourself in Christian circles that probably put too much emphasis on the devil. Anytime anything bad happens, well, it must be the devil. I think that downplays our responsibility. I think it's too simplistic. I remember being part of a church that taught that Christians had become possessed by a demon. But when you become a Christian, that light pushes out the darkness. The Bible says he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. You have an advocate with the Father, praying for you all the time. Nothing can separate you from the love of God. So any power Satan has all been received from God. But it does raise another hugely important question, doesn't it? That while we have an adversary, why do we? If God is all-powerful, why does he let Satan continue to exist? Why does he allow him to meddle with our lives this way? Well, the second big idea that we get from the book of Job is that our suffering is always purposeful. We won't fully know why God, in his wisdom, has chosen not to destroy Satan, but it seems to be that he still has certain uses for him. The Bible is full of stories in which we can conclude, along with Joseph, that while Satan meant it for harm, God intended it for our good. All the way to Jesus and the cross, and down to our very lives, Satan wants to use suffering to destroy your faith, but God's purpose for it is to strengthen your faith. Now, in the book of Job, not all of Job's friends are lousy. A fourth friend arrives on the scene further in the book. A guy called Elihu arrives, and he brings a very different perspective, and he brings clarity into the situation. Elihu rebukes Job and says, "You are wrong. God is just. God does run the world with justice. You're wrong to accuse God." And in chapter 33:29, it says this. This is Elihu speaking. God does all these things to a person, allows suffering, twice or even three times, to turn them back from the pit so that the light of life may shine. Okay? He does these things to turn them back from the pit so that the light of life might shine on them. What does he mean by the light of life shining on them? Well, I believe that God uses trials to turn us back to him. That's God's intention with our suffering, that he is infinitely wise, that God knows our hearts. And just as a doctor might prescribe difficult medicine for our bodies, God mediates the sickness of our hearts. God is the perfect physician for our souls. And the sickness that we have in our hearts is pride. Remember what happened in the fall? We wanted to be like God. It was pride in us welling up. And pride is the root of evil and problems in the world. Pride causes us to want to resist God's authority in our lives. Ever since the fall, we want to be sovereign. We want to dethrone God. Since the fall, we've been resisting God's rule in our lives. We want to be sovereign. We've dethroned God. And since we're made to worship something, we put other things in God's place. The Bible calls this idolatry. Paul in Romans chapter 1 summarizes idolatry as exchanging the truth of God for a lie, and worshipping and serving created things instead of the Creator. Elihu says that idolatry in our hearts leads us to the pit. And God does these things, allows suffering, that the light of life might shine on us. So God uses trials to expose idols in our hearts, to lead us back to him. And we can turn anything, really, into an idol. The famous French theologian John Calvin says that people are idol factories. We are just churning out idols all the time. We're searching for meaning and purpose outside of God all the time. And how do you identify an idol in your life? Well, it's anything you might turn to when you're feeling anxious or sad or frustrated. It's not God. An idol is something that causes you to say no to God. It could be something seemingly innocuous as comfort. Do you struggle to obey God if it makes you uncomfortable? It could be money. Do you struggle to surrender everything you have to God? It could be self-sufficiency. Do you struggle to be dependent on God's provision in your life? Or do you have to be in control of everything? It could be respectability. Do you struggle to honor God with your words and your decisions when it feels countercultural? It could be family life. Are you tempted to ignore God's greater purposes for your life if it gets in the way of your family life? Are you constantly trying to please siblings, parents, and children, even when you know it might contradict God? It's hard, isn't it? Because these are good things, right? Family life, money, comfort, they're all good things. We just have propensity to turn good things into God things. And these are all the ways the culture around us finds fulfillment and encourages us to not live by faith. So God uses trials to expose idols in our hearts. We have a way of kind of propping our lives on all these idols, right? You think about pillars in an ancient building. We rest our lives on these idols like pillars. But because God loves us, he is in the business of gently removing those pillars, not to harm us, but to draw us closer to him, so that the light of life might shine on us, so that we might love Jesus more than life. So we might say with David in Psalm 63, your steadfast love is better than life itself. This is what Paul is getting at when he says in Romans 8, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's not just a verse to put on your coffee cup, but that is a deep and raw truth about life and suffering. Because God has called you to something far greater, something far better than idols and the culture around us and what it treasures. God has called you to treasure Jesus above all things. Now, I haven't, as I said before, I haven't really suffered much in my life. But one time in our life, we did have a very stressful time with our neighbours who lived directly underneath us. And it caused daily anxiety and pressure on us. And I think you can accurately describe it as harassment and bullying that we were receiving. They chose to make us their enemies. And it was a daily challenge for me to find the strength not to retaliate in some kind of way. I used to kind of fantasize about all the things that I could do and say to kind of get back at them. But with God's presence, I had peace in my heart, and I didn't do those things. I found peace in the situation by submitting to God's will for my life. And if I didn't have that perspective, I probably would have been arrested. Something I regret. And that's the challenge, I think, to all of us, is to stop resisting God and to submit to what he's doing in our lives. In Hebrews 12, it says that God disciplines the ones he loves. So when you're enduring something difficult and you don't know why, perhaps one of the first questions you might want to ask is, what is God teaching you in this moment? And that's hard to accept, but the alternative is much worse. What if God just left us to our idols? Left us to this kind of shriveled
love. But God knows what we need, and he knows that we need more of him. God knows that we need to depend more on him to reject false gods. No good parent would simply watch their children make bad decisions over and over again. Now, you might say, Joe, this is all very tidy. It's all very neatly packaged. You seem to have an answer for all of this. What about all the meaningless suffering in the world? What about when you can't discern what God is teaching? Are you saying that all suffering has a purpose? And that's a good question, isn't it? It's the question that Stephen Fry was asking at the start. Now, the reason for Job's suffering is never really fully revealed to Job. And we won't always get the full answer. But the end of the book of Job does give us something to hold on to. Because God enters the scene from chapter 38. And while he doesn't give specific answers, he does give an answer for us to work with. God talks to Job. God starts to question Job instead. And he takes Job on this amazing tour of the cosmos. Says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Was Job around when God architected the constellations? Has he ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? So God has his eyes on all these cosmic details that Job has never, ever conceived of. Then God goes into detail describing all of his creation, from goats to donkeys, lions, and even mythical creatures like the behemoth and the Leviathan. Why? Because Job and his friends were just overconfident. They were overconfident about how God should govern his world. And they had these big assumptions. And God wants to put them in their place. So he deconstructs all their assumptions. And he shows Job that the universe is a vast, mysterious place. And their horizons are small and narrow. God is big, and we are not. We will never know, but God knows. And we can trust in his character and his wisdom. The great Victorian preacher Charles Spurgeon said that when we cannot trace his hand, we can trust his heart. When we don't know what God is doing, we can still trust his character and wisdom. In Romans 11, Paul quotes the Old Testament. It says, "Oh, the depths, the riches, the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counsel? Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever." So suffering is to be expected. Evil is real, and God uses our suffering primarily to reveal idols out of love to bring us closer to him. Now, I don't know if I've given you any answers, any meaningful, helpful answers today. Perhaps I've given you more questions. And that's fine, because God is not boxed in. But I truly believe the suffering is a way in which we encounter him in a unique way. And that's the point. That's the good news of Christianity, is that in Jesus, we see and experience a God who is familiar with suffering. Hebrews 4, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. In Jesus, we have someone who chose to enter our pain and lead us out of it. In Jesus, we see that Jesus shows us that God cares about our pain. He cares especially about our eternal pain. So I remember when we were going through the stress of our neighbours, I was comforted and encouraged by the reality that no matter how long it lasts, it will end one day. And that gave me a completely different perspective, to stop assuming I was in control. And that was enough for me to keep going day after day. That there will be a day when all pain and suffering ends. Job points to Jesus. This book points to Jesus, a man who suffered, was abandoned by his friends, bore the weight of our sin, and endured silence from the Father, so that we never have to. Even in your darkest moments, God is with you. You can say, along with Job, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. No matter how hard it gets, we will always see God's smile and delight in us. Stephen Fry's anger toward God is all about injustice. But the truth of the gospel is that actually we don't want justice. Justice says that Jesus doesn't go to the cross. Justice says that we remain under God's judgment. I think it'd be good, I'm just going to finish up here. I think it'd be good if anyone wants prayer for anything that has been kind of provoked in their hearts about suffering and going through difficult times. I think we should allow for some of that this morning.